Hello and welcome to this episode of The Guardian in Audio. I am Ayesha Kajee and today I'm joined by the lovely Ayesha Kajee, who won the second prize in the UN Aligned Poetry competition for her poem Silence. Ayesha is a human rights activist and political analyst who has written poems and stories since her early childhood. How are you, Ayesha? Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm well, thank you. I hope you are as well. Johannesburg's pretty hot today, actually.
Right. So we originally planned our interview for last night, but a dreadful accident happened, which made us basically cancel and reschedule this interview. When I read your message last night, I was really flabbergasted. And I was wondering if you would be amenable to discuss what happened to you. Basically, Ayesha was a victim of an armed robbery where she was given seductives and robbed at knife point.
Yeah, it was pretty traumatic. As some of your listeners and viewers might know, South Africa is a country with a very, very high Gini coefficient. In other words, there's a very huge gap between the most privileged in our society and the least privileged. There's a huge gap between rich and poor. And unfortunately, that has led to an upsurge in crime. I'm not excusing the criminality of certain elements of our society, but just saying that I can understand that sometimes people get desperate enough to resort to crime in order to try to uplift themselves or feed their families or whatever. So a friend and I were walking in the Botanic Gardens, which is not very far from my home, and two men armed with knives essentially put their hands over our mouths, put the knives near our necks, and asked us to hand over whatever valuables we had. It was pretty traumatic, as I said. Luckily, a large dog bounded into view fairly soon after this happened. We did hand over our valuables, including our mobile phones and whatever money we had with us. We tend not to walk with too many valuables. However, I was intending to go and buy groceries after the walk, so I did have more money than I generally do, more cash than I generally do have on me at any given time. And when the dog came into view, the men ran off, obviously assuming that other walkers were coming in behind the dog, which was the case. My friend and I were quite traumatized. Luckily, her mom is a medical doctor, so she treated us for shock immediately afterwards, and I have since consulted with my own medical practitioner. So hopefully there won't be too much residual PSTD, as it were. I was shaking pretty much the whole day afterwards, which my doctor says is a good sign because it means that my bodily reactions are trying to get rid of the trauma.
Well, I think I can speak on behalf of everyone when I say we're delighted that you're well at the moment. Did you contact the police for this sort of thing, or is it?
Yes. It's been reported to the local neighborhood security companies. They are private security companies, and also reported to the police.
I see. Well, a very traumatic experience, and very sorry that happened to you. Let's get started with the interview. Ayesha, tell me a little bit about yourself and your love for poetry.
Well, I've always written poetry. I can't remember a time when I didn't. You know, even as a very young child, I think my love for it perhaps was developed through my mom and my godmother, who was our neighbor, because they read poetry to me when I was a very young child. Right. And yes, and so I started writing poetry, plays, stories, essays at a very young age. But I also come from a community that doesn't place too much emphasis on literature. Although, as I said, my mother and my godmother did. And so I grew up, really appreciating the theatre, for example, and often as a child, organizing with my cousins and friends, putting on little plays during the holidays and stuff, which I'd write, and often include poetry in there. I've always had a love, I think, for classical poetry, so very lyrical poetry. Wordsworth is one of my favorites. So is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I love Shakespeare's sonnets. I'm quite old-fashioned in those ways. But I also write a variety of different styles. I love limericks, actually. I find it a really good way to express satiric humor. And I write quite a lot of haiku. I don't think I'm very good at haiku, though. And about 2 months ago, a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine who actually lives in Europe, I studied in Scotland, so I have friends scattered all over the world, challenged me to start submitting my poetry, to start actually trying to get it published. I've never been very confident about my poetry, or indeed even about my fiction writing. I write a lot, but I don't very rarely put it out there. And this particular friend of mine challenged me for at least the next few months until the end of the year to try and submit something for publication or competition or whatever, at least once every 2 weeks. And so that's what I've done, and here I am.
Right. And how did you actually hear about Unaligned?
Well, because of my work as a human rights activist, I used to run a human rights program at the local university, the University of the Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg. And I've had a sort of long-standing passion for human rights work, even prior to that. So I basically found you on the internet.
That's a very simple answer. Indeed.
And very much liked the idea of a United Nations that was not defined by nationality, but rather by humanity. And then, of course, found the poetry competition and decided, well, on one of those fortnightly deadlines I had to set myself, I decided to enter.
Yes, we do have a sort of a new column, which is poems for a better world, and this is how we thought would be best to sort of reach out to people, which actually brings me to the next question. Why do you think poetry is a good medium to portray, social and political issues? Do you think it is a good medium?
I think it is, because I think it reaches audiences at a very visceral level. It reaches them at the emotional level rather than the intellectual one. So when one wants to highlight injustice, which is perhaps the converse of human rights, it is easier to reach people who might not be amenable to hearing about those injustices through an art form. And I think all the arts are important here, the visual and performing arts as well as literature, music as well, and poetry is, of course, very closely related to music. So I think it is a great medium. Also having friends who write poetry, real poets. I don't often think of myself as a real poet. I know that many of them who live under conditions of injustice, for example, in places like Palestine or Rwanda or many places on the African continent where I've lived and worked, for example, find that it's easier to express their dilemmas, the challenges of their lives, living under perhaps authoritarian rule, having their land taken away from them, trying to make peace in communities where there is currently conflict, etc., that they find that it's easier to conscientize people through
Right.
poetry because of the metaphor involved. I think we as humans are evolved to understand things through simile and metaphor, to better understand them at an emotional and visceral level than we are perhaps to prose and hard, cold facts at an intellectual level.
Of course. Of course. It's very fascinating. The thing is, we don't really hear about African poetry and African literature that much. I mean, we do hear a lot about the French and English poems that arise from Africa. Are there any sort of particular works that are your favorites that are, you know, political, bold, and activist, that are written in African that you're particularly passionate about?
Yes, there are. There is a wonderful compilation that came out a few years ago that is mainly, it's both contributions of prose and poetry, but it's mainly women in Africa. And one of the areas of my research focus is gender justice, which is, of course, very important in Africa. And allied to that is, I think my three focus areas in terms of human rights are gender rights, freedom of expression, and transitional justice. And those three come together so well in the poetry written by many women on this continent. So yes, I do have favorites, some of them South African poets and writers, some of them further afield. But I've also found that for myself, poetry has been cathartic because in my work, in my real paid for work, I have sometimes had to grapple with so much injustice and so much arrogation and abrogation of people's rights, that for me to write about those experiences in poetry have been a form of letting the pain go, in a way, because one tends to, when you listen to other people's stories of conflict, stories of war, stories of unimaginable brutality in many instances, one takes on other people's pain, one sits with their pain, shares their pain. You can't experience their pain the way they do, but I think part of being human and working in the right sphere is to take on some of that pain. And then sometimes one doesn't know what to do with it. It's so much in your consciousness that you have to find an outlet for it. And for me, writing about it has been an outlet.
I wonder, how do you think Unaligned as an organization can help poets and activists like yourself with the promotion of their work and their ideals?
Well, I think that, you know, just the recognition you're bringing through these efforts is important. But in terms of promotion of their work, I think, you know, perhaps the Guardian as a newsletter, as a magazine dedicated to greater awareness, but also I think it could be a forum for bringing poets together from different parts of the world to share experiences, to share different forms of poetry. You've mentioned that African poetry, for example, is not very well known, and that is true. And there are some very unique forms of African poetry. For example, I entered, you know, the year my mom was really ill, I entered a poem in a competition specifically for African haiku. And I was a runner-up in that competition. As I said, I don't often enter things, but it was interesting to see that something that is essentially, or regarded as something that is regarded as being so essentially Oriental, Japanese in nature, can take on a very different form in Africa. And when it brings into that form Kigo, which is the word in haiku for seasonal words. You know, an example of seasonal words in these haiku would be cherry blossoms or plum trees or seasonal plum rains, they call them in Japanese. Some of the corresponding examples, though, that are very different here in Africa are things like the harmattan, which is a kind of warm wind that blows in the Sahel region of the continent. And here in South Africa, we have an equivalent called the berg winds, which blow off the mountains. So, you know, those are seasonal words that are very uniquely African. Or when one thinks of the enormous migration of the wildebeest and deer and antelope and zebra in the Serengeti in East Africa, it is one of the, I think, one of the unacknowledged wonders of the world to have that seasonal migration happen each year of hundreds of thousands of animals across huge distances. And that is something that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely. If you would be interested, do provide us with poems or a link to your works, and we'll be very happy to attach it in your piece, so our readers can follow your work and your
sure.
poetry. Okay, so would you mind reading your poem for us and giving us a little bit more insight into it?
Sure, I can do that. I'm just going to bring it up on my screen. So my poem is called Silence, and it has 4 parts to it. Silence. Silence is explicit. Silence is complicit. Complicity is violence. So in the violence of our silence, let us take stock of our complicity. Our complicity silences truth, muffles honor, rapes innocence, the same innocence we plead, confronted by shattered delusion we didn't know. We wished to not know, blinded, deafened, didn't. We turned away, bedecked ourselves in laurel, which now turns to rue. Our silence, yours and mine, is explicit. It is complicit. It is violent. And in its complicit, explicit violence, we too have bloodied our souls. So yes, not a very uplifting poem, but yes.
Thank you very much. You reading it gave it a whole new life. I mean, you don't get every day where the poet actually recites their own poem, and we're incredibly lucky to have you there doing that. I wonder, you chose the first UN-aligned article, which is clarifying and upholding human rights is a fundamental duty of state and citizens, to be relating to your poem. I wonder if you could sort of tell me a little bit about the reason behind your choice.
Yes, you know, I was conflicted between the first article and the 14th, frankly, because I think it relates to them both. But I do think it is a duty, it is a responsibility of people everywhere. If we are to retain our individual and collective humanity, then we really need to pay more attention to our responsibility to uphold human rights as a fundamental duty, not just of our governments, or not just because we belong to the United Nations, but because we're human. Because if we uphold only our own rights and those of people we know, then we lose some of our humanity in ignoring and or refusing to see, or remaining silent when we do see that other people's rights are being infringed upon in fundamental ways, in basic ways, such as, other people not having the freedom to express themselves, for example, or other people not having adequate shelter or sustenance, or being able to live in peace and out of conflict. So yes, as I said, I think that is a very fundamental duty, responsibility of anyone who claims to be a decent human being. But when I mentioned Article 14, that particular article of the UN aligned mission looks at occasions when individuals or groups find themselves in difficulty, and it says it's the duty of those in a position to help to do so in proactive and preemptive ways. And I think very often we don't recognize that duty as applying to us as individuals. We leave it to organizations such as the United Nations, or such as our governments, or our local charities, our NGOs, whatever. We see it as somebody else's responsibility and not one that we need to become involved in.
Of course. And in your poem, you talk about silence. Obviously, a lot of people think of silence as in, well, what can I do? I'm just a random person in a random country doing some random thing. What exactly can I do? What would you respond to that?
I would respond to that every time we think that of ourselves, we diminish ourselves, and we also abrogate our responsibility towards our fellow human beings. So yes, it's very easy to either say there's nothing I can do, or to belittle the attempts of other people to do something by saying, oh, well, they're armchair activists. But in a world that is so interconnected, and we are interconnected because we live in a world where there is the internet, where there are online campaigns, social media campaigns, groups that raise funds, for example, through social media, that ask for signatures in support of, or in defiance against some infringement of rights. And I would say to people that if you start there at that very basic level of saying, I will not support that somebody can be moved off their land purely because they are not a specific race or religion or nationality, that they can be moved off their land where their ancestors have lived for generations. Or I'm not going to support, an instance where people's rights to say what they think are silenced because their governments don't like what they're saying.
Right.
Or where children are removed from their parents, as happened under the Trump administration, purely because their parents are illegal or so-called illegal migrants.
Of course, yeah.
So I would say to people, start small, choose a cause that's close to your heart. For whatever reason, maybe because your parents were immigrants and you want to support the cause of migrants. Or maybe because you belong to a specific race, religion, group, but don't let it stop with what is germane to you because of your specific identity. Start to expand that so that you live a life that sees other people as human, not because they're similar to you, but purely because they're human, not because they're of the same class or race or religion as you, but because they're different, and because there is so much beauty in difference, if we would just recognize that and appreciate and respect one another's differences and learn about one another.
Indeed. In other words, don't be afraid to be a sharetivist and a clicktivist, as they say.
Yes.
Of course, it's you know, after all, about integrity, and people should start where they can. Ayesha, I wondered if you see yourself as being able to contribute to UN Alliance mission in the future. As you know, we do share a similar vision. We do fight for a planet that, for an alternative United Nations that put humanity before nationality and a planet before greed. Would you see yourselves being able to help us achieve this mission?
Very much so, and I'd like to explore ways to do that through perhaps starting up a local parish, but also in other ways. I think there are ways for UN Aligned to actually contribute to educating people about rights, and I'd like to be part of that. For example, some of the work I currently do is very much about training people how to fact check, for example. Now, that might not seem closely related to rights, but it is. Because when people disseminate and share information that hasn't been checked, that isn't true, and share it specifically in echo chambers that may be somewhat prejudiced, bigoted, whatever, it entrenches the problems of injustice. Something else I do that you know started off really idealistic, but has evolved into something really wonderful, and I'd like to see it replicated, is every day on every year on Women's Day in this country, I invite, and in the last 2 years it's been a virtual thing because of COVID-19 and lockdown, but I invite friends, colleagues, etc., people I know, to come to my house, to gather at my house to eat soup. It started off as a picnic when I lived in Cape Town and graduated to something of a soup thing when I lived in Glasgow, and then became very much entrenched as a so-called a soup day here. The idea is to get people to interact with one another who might not normally meet one another. So people from different backgrounds, meaning races, religions, ages. I think intergenerational communication is very important. Careers, so I have friends in the media, I have friends in academia where I used to work, I have friends in who are journalists, who are artists, who are poets, theater people, because theater is a big love of mine, musicians, and to try and get them together and interact with one another. And it has honestly had such amazing spin-offs in different years. It's, you know, ambassadors have helped former students of mine gain employment. This year, the mother of a very dear friend offered post-traumatic counseling at a collective level to anybody who wanted to attend about a month after Soup Day. So, you know, COVID-related PSDD, because that is something that actually does occur as a result of people losing livelihoods, losing connections, living on their own, having lost loved ones to COVID, etc. So that's what happened this year. Every time one of these days happens, something new and valuable, well, what seems to me to be valuable anyway, seems to come out of it. And I would just like to encourage people to set aside some time for those at their workplaces or in their neighborhoods or people they meet on the commute to and from work. Just try and get to know someone who isn't like you. It will make the world a better place. I'm sorry about that. My phone's just going. I'm just going to
That is indeed good advice.
Oops, sorry. I ought to have ensured that I put that onto silent mode. I'm so sorry I didn't.
That's absolutely fine.
Um,
That's absolutely fine. Indeed, Ayesha, you're an incredible asset to us and to anyone whose dream is to see more in humans than nationality and these arbitrary labels that we put on them. Thank you very much for talking to me, and I hope we could stay in touch and explore various ways on to bring our ideals come true.
That would be fantastic. I look forward to greater communication as well, Ariana. Thank you so much for having me in this conversation and also for selecting my poem. I'm actually quite excited that it has been selected. I didn't expect that at all.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this interview. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a free UN Aligned member. Visit our website for more information about that. Many thanks to Ayesha for this inspiring and lovely talk. And take good care of yourselves and see you next time. Bye.